Prior to the mid-17th century, there was a large village of Carrier Indians on the west bank of the Stewart River, just north of its confluence with the Nichaco. They were allied by dialect and blood ties to the Carriers of Nagasley, Stony Creek, and the surrounding areas. The village's principal chief was a man by the name of Adin Ted, the grandfather of the great Chief Kwah of the 1800s. According to legend, the hostile Chilcotins from the south were intent on avenging the death of one of their big men, and Adin Ted was singled out by the shaman to be the victim. It mattered not whether he was in fact the one responsible for the death of the man. This all happened around 1745. A battle took place that was to change the population distribution of the region. As I said, Adin Ted was the grandfather of Chief Kwah. Their main salmon fishing village was down in Chunlac, at the confluence of the Stewart and Nichaco. It was better in the shallow waters of the Stewart, so they came every summer to their village for fishing. Almost every other tribe, like the Chilcotins and Nazcotins, wanted to take it over from them, but Adin Ted staved them off, saying it was his village by heritage and no one was going to take it from him and his people. One summer, Adin Ted and some of his men, coming to get things ready for the fishing season, came upon some men by surprise. They were wrecking and burning everything in sight. Adin Ted and his men shot arrows at them as they fled. They knew by the looks of it that they had wounded one of them. They later found out it was some men from Chilcotin area, and the man they wounded had died, and all the people were mad and on the warpath. But they waited until all the Carrier people had moved into their village for the salmon season. Everybody had settled nicely into their repaired wigwams made of poles and spruce branches, erected their drying racks, and all was ready, except for the drying poles and weirs which had been destroyed by the enemy. So most of the men with Adin Ted in the lead ported their canoes further up the river to get some suitable wood for building weirs and drying poles for the racks. By the time they got enough, it was quite late in the afternoon. They loaded their canoes and were ready to go when they spotted 6 canoes coming towards them. Most of the men got scared, saying, "It's the Chilcotins. They have come to kill us all." But Adin Ted told them, "It's me they want. All of you run into the bush and hide. I will face them alone." His 2 sons volunteered to stay by him, but he told them he would shoot them himself rather than let the Chilcotins have them. So they reluctantly left him and ran into the bush, but not too far, as they were worried about him. When the Chilcotins came close enough, they started shooting at him. He eluded the arrows and suddenly remembered the running deer. How, when you shoot arrows at him, he jumps up and down so fast you miss him with every shot. So he would jump on a fallen log or a rock, and the arrows passed below him. More arrows coming at him, he would jump down and lie flat behind the log, and the arrows passed above him harmlessly. Then he'd jump up again and shout the war cry. Finally, the Chilcotin chief, whose name was Khatpan, called to his men to stop firing as they could not hit him and their arrows were dwindling because they had used most of them in the razed village. Also, he got scared that the man was protected by spirits. Then Khatpan called out to Gadin Tel, "You have the reputation of being a brave and fearless man. If you are, come out and dance for me, then I will spare your life." Realizing that he was in a very delicate predicament, the courier chief came into the open shore and danced to the accompaniment of the head Chilcotin singing and beating on the canoe until he fell on the sand of the beach from exhaustion. As the Chilcotins turned to depart, he shouted at them that some spring morning, when the hailstorms come and they least expected him, he would make them a return visit. He vowed that he would see the old chief suffer for the humiliation of making him dance for him to his own Chilcotin song. But he wondered why they didn't kill him on the spot. When he and his companions got back to the village, he knew why he had been spared. When he and his companions got back to their village, his question was answered. His village lay in ruins. The only signs of life were the scavenging ravens and jays, which flapped off as he approached. His tribesmen lay in pools of blood. His 2 wives lay dead and mutilated, but he found worse. Split open and spitted like salmon were the bodies of his and other men's children. 2 pole racks held the lifeless bodies in the sun. Only a few of the villagers survived, those who had been absent or those who ran into the bush to escape the murderous attack. Reverently, the survivors gathered the bodies and in the manner of their people placed them in a funeral pyre. Some surviving widows would gather the ashes in a little bag and wear them around their necks for a year. Adintel's grief and anger were great, but they did not overwhelm his good sense. It was not wise to immediately launch a reprisal. The Chilcotins would be expecting them. So he and his villagers waited while the leaves turned and snow fell and cottonwoods budded, and around countless smoky lodge fires they plotted revenge and gathered support from other carrier bands. In the spring of the 3rd year after the massacre, as the last snow was melting from the north-facing slopes and the sandbar willows began to bud, Adintel gathered a war party of Chunlac survivors and men from the neighboring villages. When they were all ready, he told them of the great warrior Gunjus, to watch out for him as he was a great big man, fearless and strong, and a great warrior, expert in battle. The brother of Khatpan, the Chilcotin chief, he always wore some sort of an armor that no spear or arrow could penetrate. "We will have to take him by surprise. It's our only chance," said Adintel. Now in the party was a little man of very insignificant nature. He had been an orphan raised by his grandmother. His name was Wasi Nanadnin, Lynx Face. When he heard about Gunjus, he spoke up saying, "If no one is able to take Gunjus, call me. I'll take him for you." other men laughed at him, saying, "Just look at him. Who does he think he is, challenging the great warrior Gunjus?" But Wasinanadinin only smiled at them, saying nothing. So they started down the Nitako in their canoes. After they passed the forest and came to the grasslands, they camped about 10 miles from the Chilikutan village in a hidden ravine, so their campfire smoke would not be detected from afar. Kadintel chose 2 swift runners to go ahead and spy on the enemy village. The 2 men came to the village in early morning. The village was situated across the river from them. From the high hill they were on, they took stock of the village. It looked as if they were ready to move out. It was a little village all in a long row by the river. A few wisps of smoke drifted over the river. In one part of the village was a lodge protected by a strong palisade, a practice some tribes for anyone expecting trouble. Inside the lodge were 2 women, a young courier woman from Khatpan, whom Khatpan had captured for his brother Gunjus, and her little brother, also the wife of Gunjus, was there. Now the young courier woman was always alert and expectant, as she had heard that what Kadintel had shouted after them, that he would return some spring day and revenge the atrocity committed against his people. She would go down to the river every morning and look all around and listen. This morning she saw across the river, high up on the hill, 2 young spruce trees where there had been none. As she looked, the young trees took a different position. Right away she knew what it meant. She went back into the lodge and did her work as always. Then, when she wasn't being observed, she whispered to her young brother that the time had come for them to get ready to depart, that he should be ready to move at a minute's notice. Dress up in your good clothes and make sure your moccasins are tied up good. Do not eat too much, as you will have to sleep lightly tonight. As soon as you hear any noise, slip outside and run into the nearest bush. I will be right behind you. So they were ready by nightfall. Everybody else was busy packing up and getting ready to leave camp by morning. All she had was a small bag that women always carried, tied to their belt or around their wrists. It contained some sinew and oil used for sewing and other small personal things. In Indian it was called latapat, handbag. When the 2 spies got back to camp that night, they told Kadintel that the Chilikutans were getting ready to move out. They are wary and expectant and in much of a hurry, they said. But Kadintel didn't seem to worry about that. Do not worry, they will leave tonight. By dawn we will be right in their village before they know it. With that, he told his men to take a good rest, as they would start out before dawn, so they would reach the village while most of them were still in bed fast asleep. In the Chilikutan village, all was quiet. Most canoes were loaded up for early departure, but they had to wait for Khatpan, the chief, who had gone to gather up his snares and traps before leaving camp. So far he had not returned to the village. Also, some of the men were missing, who also, like Whut'en, had gone to pick up their snares and traps after a whole winter of trapping and hunting. The great Kunduz, who was always alert and ever watchful, was already awake. Kunduz was up early the spring morning. Suddenly, from all directions, he heard the battle cries of the avenging carriers as they stormed the village. Dropping everything, he ran to his lodge, shouting to awaken the villagers. The carrier slave and her brother were already escaping after tying the Chilcotin's war club to the lodge wall to delay his pursuit. Helped by his wife, the great warrior quickly put on his double armor of dried wooden rods. Over this he pulled a sleeveless tunic of moose skin covered with a coat of glued sand and pitch. Kunduz left his protective palisade to face his attackers, launching arrow after arrow while protecting a young son who had crouched between his legs. Then the boy was hit by an arrow and Kunduz ran out of arrows. The surprise attack overwhelmed the Chilcotins, and as the battle went in other parts of the village, the carriers recognized Kunduz was holding attackers at bay with a spear made from a dagger and long pole. They attacked from all sides, but his armor protected him from arrows and spear thrusts. Then someone remembered Wasi Nanadnin and his boast, so he was called to do what he boasted of, and he came forward. As he drew close, Kunduz thrust his spear at the little man. It only grazed his outer garment, and the little man grabbed the spear shaft. The carriers rushed in. They smashed his brains in, and still filled with lust, and not satisfied with his death, they leaped on him and mutilated his body into an unrecognizable mass of raw meat. The Chilcotin village had fallen to the carriers of Chunlac and lay in smoking ruins. There was one disappointment for Adintel. They had not found Whut'en, the originator of the previous slaughter. In final retaliation, they erected 3 poles of children spitted in a similar manner to the 2 poles of Chunlac children 3 years earlier. They left taking a few slaves, leaving only empty lodges, with nothing living except a few dogs prowling the few remains. A short time later, the Chilcotin Whut'en returned to his ravaged village. Not stopping to bury the dead, he gathered a few fugitives from the dense river thickets and set out in pursuit. He overtook the war party as they crossed a river and saw his favorite daughter being dragged away. Adintel shouted across the river to Whut'en, "People say that you are a man and you would pass yourself off as a terrible warrior. If you be such, come on, Whut'en, and don't retreat." Whut'en started across the river, but when he saw how many warriors there were, he started weeping and ran back to his side of the shore. But Adintel shouted at him, "When I was all alone against your people, when you had me cornered on the river bank wanting to kill me, I danced for you at your bidding. Now if you are a man, dance for me as I did for you." But Whut'en, standing on the side of the river with his feet in the water, advanced a few steps and ran back to shore. Thinking of his people lying mutilated a few miles away and seeing his daughter being chased by the carriers, his legs could not support him. Neither could he dance, so he sat in the water, sobbing wildly and begging for his daughter's life. Full of scorn, Adintel shouted at him, "Hashban, it is upon men that we come down to avenge a great wrong. I see that you are worse than an old woman and not a man, therefore I will allow you to live. Go in peace and cry to your heart's content." The carriers, their work done, turned their backs on the Chilcotins and continued the long journey home. Conclusion. Though they satisfied their lust for revenge, the village of Chunlac was left vacant for some years until his son-in-law, Kw'eh, returned some years later with the Nazcotans and had a claim to the village, and Kw'eh and his people were massacred by them. That leads to Chief Kwah's last battle. The few survivors returned to Nagazli and Adintel settled at Shadley, meaning the confluence of Nichako and Fraser, when later on it was called Fort George. Adintel married a Shadley woman and by this wife had a daughter, Samalti, who died in 1842, half-sister to Kw'eh's wife, Chief Kwah's mother. At the age of 90 years, she told the story to her descendants, the story of her great warrior father, Adintel, who avenged his people and his village. All his descendants, even I know the legend as it was told over and over through the years. I learned it from my father, Leoncho. It was told to Father Morris years later by the descendants of Chief Kwah right here in Nagazli village. There's a P.S. there. The reason Wasi Nanadin wasn't hurt by the spear thrust of Unjus was he had made himself a moose hide vest, pitch and sand matted onto the hair on the outside, the same as Unjus had on.